Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today again as part of our celebrations of the 150th anniversary of St. Paul's Parish. Some of you may remember that Father Evans came back in February to give the first part of this two-series lecture. He spoke about the history of the Archdiocese of Boston, which was really a wonderful presentation. And then we were meant to have this conversation the following Sunday, but God intervened and he said, "You shall not," and there was a snowstorm. So, but very happy that Father Evans was able to join us. In the intervening time between his last lecture and this, Father Evans has the happy news that that the Archbishop has accepted his retirement. So, we only hate him a little. But I'm delighted that Father Evans will have the opportunity after how many years of ordination?
48.
After 48 years of ordination to, to have an opportunity to live at a different pace and also to continue his work in research and teaching, which is such a great love for him. So we look forward to this presentation this morning. We'll go for about 45 minutes or so, and then we'll have an opportunity for questions. Yeah. Okay, so, and Father Evans was among the first in his little swag bag here. I gave him an invitation to our 150th anniversary Mass in October. So he's the first to receive a hand-delivered one. So happy to do that. So yeah, if you could welcome Father Evans again. Thank you.
Thank you to Father Bill Kelly, my colleague of many years, 37 years ordained himself, so no small contribution. Good to be with you. Last time I forgot to leave time for questions at the end, so I'll try to do that this time. And as I begin, at this talk, I would say something that wouldn't apply as much last time. Some of you are going to know more about particular things that I mention because of family lore or personal experience or whatever. And also, I'm going to veer toward the earlier history than the later. So the stuff that's involving pastors who are still alive, not so much featured here. The last pastor to serve who is deceased was Bishop Bowles. Anyway, so we'll emphasize the early history, but there's a lot to say. And I'm going to start out by saying this. Why, and there's a little outline on the top left. By the way, this is for your perusing pleasure. I don't mind if you look through it while I talk. My first point is, why is St. Paul's history so interesting? I've been saying that to people as I've been preparing this, and I'm just going to give you I'm going to cut to the bottom line of why I think it's interesting, and hopefully the talk would bear out what I'm about to say. But I'm just going to almost list with a little bit of explication right now some of the factors that I think make St. Paul's history rather unique and exciting. First of all, the breadth of involvements and properties in the history of the parish. Sometimes properties can be a real bugaboo to pastors, but they really are a source of life for the parish. And also the involvements that this parish has had over the years, due to many different factors, not just maybe the first you might think of. And then the next thing would be, not surprisingly, town and gown, which has with it kind of a sense of ecumenism and civic affairs and particular people who made the town and the gown relate as they did. Next thing would be its tradition of liturgy and music. And the next one, demographics, both Boston area demographics, which would affect any parish, but also some particular demographics here, and also some church demographics in the aftermath of Vatican II. Next one, length of the pastorates, and length of the stay of some of the other priests too. One of the longest numbers on the whole chart is sitting in our front row, Father Salzman there, as a chaplain. The next one, a heresy that happened right here, in fact, right on this street, dare I say, Feeneyism, for want of a better word. Another one would be prominent figures. Another one, and this is to its credit, given everything else that was going on, deep Christian service toward the poor. And I had a sister in high school, Sister Mona, who taught here for many years, and then I had her at Matignon High School. And she said that Monsignor Hickey's love for the poor was so outstanding, she was, for the whole life after that, really touched by his witness. And she taught here for many years and at Matignon for many years. The next one would be the association for many, many years with the Sisters of St. Joseph, one of the longest in the diocese associations. And then lastly, the magnificence of the church. But to that I would add, because there are many magnificent churches, thank God, a magnificence of a church and how it reflects its setting. So those are the things that strike me. You might think, what else could he have said makes our history so interesting? I probably could have said some others, but I'll try to pepper those into whatever we talk about next. So let's start with an introduction. On the paper, on the outline, it says, Cambridge before a Catholic parish began. So, Boston, 1630, founded by the Puritans. Newtown, settled the same year, now known as Cambridge. 8 years later, they started calling it Cambridge. And Harvard, established, as you probably well know, 1636. And Cambridge and Boston were originally solidly Puritan, very committed religious people, but not at all open to the Catholic approach. In fact, they came over here because they thought the rest of those people in England who broke away from the Catholic Church stayed too close to the Catholics. We're going to do something different. Wait till you see what we can do. And Cambridge was a rural area, and in the mid-18th century, so I've really jumped here, a mission began for others than Puritans. The Anglicans got a mission church, Christ Church. You can picture it over on the other side of the common, right? And it had barely a dozen households. They were really in the minority. And Catholics were very, very few. If you were Catholic in the 1700s, you had no church. You had to go into some other church or just pray by yourself. But in 1790 came a Catholic congregation in Boston, and you had to go to it if you were from Cambridge. It was an 8-mile trek from approximately here. And then in 1828, they established St. Mary's in Charlestown, and things became a little bit closer for some people who might have lived in Cambridge. And then in the 1820s to the 1840s, there was an Irish influx into Boston and to some extent into Cambridge in East Cambridge. Now, when I say there was an Irish influx in the 1820s and toward the 1840s, that was nothing like the flood that was going to succeed the influx, and that was caused by the potato famine in Ireland. In 1834, there was some expression from some Harvard people. We're worried about trouble with newcomers to the place. And others from within the same social group said, don't worry, we respect all people, we want to protect all people. And so there was right from the beginning maybe some opposition to Catholics and Irish immigrants, Catholic immigrants coming, but there was always a sense of we welcome them too. So it wasn't an overly easy thing of opposition, you know? And East Cambridge in the 1830s and 40s soon had a predominance of Catholics. They came for the particular industries that set up shop there. In 1846, Cambridge became a city, and it had 3 rival villages, as it says in one source. Old Cambridge would be here and west. Cambridge Port, which would be not just down south of Central Square, but really anything east of here, and then East Cambridge, which was for Catholics the main part of Cambridge. And Old Cambridge had that rural character surrounding Harvard. Central Square was pretty much the town center, especially for average people. And Central Square benefited from the opening of bridges. In 1793, there was the Longfellow Bridge, and then there was, in 1809, the bridge that leads you from Museum of Science toward Lechmere. Notice that would be helpful if you lived in East Cambridge, right? So even in the mid-18th century, almost all the residents were Puritan descendants, farmers and artisans and tradesmen. It says in one source that there were some Anglican families around Harvard Square, and they were described this way in an online source I found. They lived apart from village affairs, relied on outside incomes, entertained lavishly in grand homes along Tory Row, Brattle Street, okay? But the Catholics didn't have much to do with that life, you know. Of course, the famine sent the Irish out in great numbers, the Irish to East Cambridge, where they already were, and then to North Cambridge, to the brickyards and clay pits there, with crowded workers' cottages. There were some blacks and some Jews, and unskilled jobs in glassworks and furniture factories in Cambridge is what greeted a lot of the people who were the Irish immigrants. There were 3 parishes that were established before St. Paul's in Cambridge. By the way, there's a chart of all the boundaries of St. Paul's parish. The boundaries come out a little light, but I think you can read them. And then an explanation of the other parishes in Cambridge. But 3 of them precede St. Paul's. Not surprisingly, the first one was in East Cambridge. It's a little tricky in its nomenclature. It was called St. John's in Cambridge. If you think of St. John's, Cambridge, you might be traveling up Massachusetts Avenue. It has absolutely no connection with that parish. One didn't move to the other or anything like that. It was called St. John's Parish in Cambridge over in East Cambridge. Heavily Catholic population there. Protestant converts were the first ones who prompted the start of a parish. They bought a lot in the 1830s. Then they leased a former Methodist academy for a Sunday school. They were joined by the Irish, who pushed for a church. And the church was called St. John's. They found a better lot than the first one they thought they were going to build on, and they built. You can picture Sacred Heart Church over there. In 1883, they had a new church on a new site and a new name for the parish. Instead of St. John's, Cambridge, it came to be called from 1883 onward, Sacred Heart, Cambridge. It's still there. It covers a whole city block between 6th and 7th Streets. And their famous pastor was Monsignor O'Brien. His name lives on in the highway that goes from the Boston line to the Somerville line across near Lechmere Square. And Monsignor O'Brien was very literate. He had a magazine called the Sacred Heart Review, which is something of a rival for the Pilot. And he was particularly strong on certain issues, very opinionated man, not crazy about our need to have our own Catholic schools, but eventually he did have a school there. I'd add one little thing from Sacred Heart, and then we won't go back to it. When I was a kid in 1963, if I could guess, one day there was a huge fire in Sacred Heart Church in East Cambridge. I remember I asked my father when we were driving by there to go and see the church, and it had a big hole in the roof. That's what I remembered. But they fixed it, and it's still there, and it has a lot of construction going on around it now. They're retooling it all somehow. All right, so that's East Cambridge. And obviously, once that church came, Cambridge had a church, but it was in one corner of the city. Then in 1848 came St. Peter's Church. Interestingly, it was, and that's west of Harvard Square, right? And interestingly, it was the work of Father Manassas Doherty from St. John's, later to be Sacred Heart Church, East Cambridge, that brought about St. Peter's Church. And then he became the pastor over at St. Peter's. He had Mass in a hall right near Harvard Square in the 1840s. Then they got their church, basement first, then upper church, and it was very much a mother church to many other churches, St. Peter's in Cambridge. In one place it's described as never a parish that was in the 1800s all that big, but it gave birth to a lot of other churches around and beyond it. The upper church was closed for many years. You may know now it's been reopened many decades. And what was the boundary between the East Cambridge parish and St. Peter's? Prospect Street, which is pretty far over to the east to be the boundary, but it shows how the population probably was. So all this area was St. Peter's after 1848. And the street that has the rectory at St. Peter's is called Manassas Avenue. Father Manassas Doherty was the founder of their parish. And he did a lot for St. Paul's, too. But before St. Paul's came along, in between Sacred Heart and St. Paul's came St. Mary's Parish, which was completely separating was what was to be St. Paul's from Sacred Heart. It ran from the Somerville line down to the river. And the St. John's pastor had some foresight to purchase property that had been the old town hall of Cambridge, and they had a lot of stops and starts to bring about St. Mary's, but it opened in 1867 after the Civil War, and they were famous for having a pastor who was full of energy, Father Thomas Scully. And he established all kinds of activities, including, besides a gym and a temperance union and all that, he established what today we would call a junior college, St. Thomas Aquinas College. It only lasted a few years, but it was certainly something worthwhile. So all that leads up to the coming of a new parish to Cambridge, which we now call St. Paul's. So in the mid-18th century, in the mid-19th century, I should say, Catholics in central Cambridge grew steadily. And Father Manassas Doherty, the pastor of St. Peter's, bought a congregational meeting house at the northwest corner of Mount Auburn Street and Holyoke. And St. Paul's Parish was established in 1875, and being established as a parish meant it got its own pastor. So a church can be a place where we gather for worship, but a parish is the people, the legal entity, too, under the leadership of a pastor. So it had a pastor after having a little bit of life before, 2 years before that. In 1875, Father William Orr, who was to serve for 32 years, came, and he was the pastor. 2 years after the church was founded, it had 120 confirmations, 100 First Communions. Father Orr was kind of a character, from what I can see, large-hearted, energetic, very pro-Irish independence, not particularly sophisticated. The thing I would say, from my hindsight and yours, would be he wasn't certainly picked because he would be something of a guide to Harvard in any way. He was just probably the priest that was available. And he had mostly tolerance and goodwill toward people of other religions and all that. He had a rectory south of Mount Auburn Street and Holyoke Street at the site of Lowell House, what is now Lowell House on the Harvard campus. He had a lot of good energy. In the 1880s, he acquired St. Paul's Cemetery in Arlington. If you've ever gone by St. Paul's Cemetery on Broadway in Arlington, right up against Alewife Brook, that's called St. Paul's because it was the St. Paul's Parish Cemetery. It's long, long, long been an archdiocesan cemetery, so St. Paul's neither gets the benefit or the onus of having that cemetery. But in 1889, he also did something rather pioneering. He established a Catholic school for his 14-year-old parish. The school was built and open. He bought the Gordon McKay estate, basically this property here, okay? And he converted a house on it, nice-looking house on it, to a convent for the Sisters of St. Joseph of Boston. It was, in the course of their lives as sisters in this archdiocese, they staffed in some way or another, at one time or another, about 80 different parish schools. St. Paul's was only the 6th school they staffed. They went from Jamaica Plain to South Boston, Stoughton, Haverhill and Amesbury, and then here. So this parish was the 3rd parish right around Boston that was theirs. And he began constructing a school on the site. He was financially unable to build a new church yet, so he decided to substantially expand the existing church. Notice he had to be very frugal. You get that idea, don't you? In 1903, he had a dream for a church on this site, but the dream fizzled for financial reasons, I'm sure. And then in 1906, as Harvard acquired properties, many of the parishioners who were living there got displaced, which becomes kind of a theme down through the years here. And that was the year of Father Orr's death. But before he died, he bought, at an expensive cost, a heavily mortgaged site where Ellery Street meets Massachusetts Avenue. So you can see how the parish has had quite an expanse of different properties. And down there, he was able to buy some property that was used in different ways over the years. 1907, the same year that a new archbishop came, William Cardinal O'Connell, St. Paul's got a new pastor, but he wasn't exactly new. He had been the parochial vicar, as we now say, for 18 years before he came as pastor, directly from being parochial vicar. It seems it's about his only assignment. And he had that assignment for 18 years. So from 07 to 25, he was St. Paul's pastor, Father John Ryan. On my outline, I put Murphy. I don't know. I must have been doing it late at night as I do so many things. It should say Father Ryan's time. There's a picture of Orr, there's a little sketch of Orr and a picture of Ryan in your little compendium there. Now, Father Ryan was more sophisticated than Father Orr. He painstakingly reconsidered, where should we put our new church? In 1908, the new archbishop gifted the parish a Newman house for the college across the street around where the old rectory used to be, behind my back here. In 1915, the convent was torn down because they had hopes of building a church on this site, which they eventually did. And from that property that the former pastor had bought just before he died, down at Massachusetts and Ellery Street, the sisters got moved down to 1033 Massachusetts Avenue, where if you're a longstanding St. Paul's parishioner, you might remember them as having come each day to teach in the school. Now it's a big kind of drab 60s building, 70s building. In 1916, the cornerstone was laid here for a new church. And Cardinal O'Connell had some words of warning. So let me just quote them. I'm not going to quote a lot, but this is a quote that's worth it. Cardinal O'Connell said in his sermon, "There is very grave danger not far distant from this sacred edifice. It is the growing tendency to separate science from faith and spiritual from material forces. Prominent educators are striving to undermine the foundation of all truth, the source of all knowledge, of all life, Christian faith." We could argue about how you might say some of those things even today, but Cardinal O'Connell said it without mentioning the word Harvard. And in another place, similarly, he said that we're right near a great temple of learning. He gave credit to the great influential institution nearby, but he reminded his audience that centuries ago, Oxford and Cambridge in England also forgot their duty to their mother and have hence missed the way in their campaign for the truth. This sacred edifice, this temple of God, St. Paul's new church, possesses the whole truth, the real truth, the fundamental truth. And so in 1923, the opening of the new church after World War I, and those last words were from that moment. What was happening in the parish during these years was an influx of people who came to work as domestics, and a lot of people who were workers in the printing world at the Riverside Press. From 1852 to 1973, that was a great employer in this neighborhood. By the way, the school was prospering. After it had been established for 11 years, right at the turn of the century, the city of Cambridge decided that they would not test the St. Paul's graduates with their own test for admission to the public school, they decided, after many years of seeing good results on the tests, the St. Paul's graduates could get right in to the public high school of Cambridge. In 1924, the old church and rectory was sold to Harvard, and the money was used for a rectory that was built right behind me across the street on Mount Auburn Street. And also, there was a purchase around that time of 2 houses on Mount Auburn Street. So you can see how they were always thinking, how can we make the best of our property decisions? And money was tight. By the way, a little aside, when the church was being built, there was a little bit of a fight over what kind of pews, if any, should we have in the church. And some people were arguing for a European-style church with no pews, but pews won out. At the church dedication, there was an escort parade all the way up Putnam Avenue. I just drove up Putnam Avenue, and people were really, really happy to have the new church. And as we think about that, we think about the fact that Father Ryan's vision is reflected in the church's architectural choices. The Church of the Living Son of God, the pillar and ground of truth. It says right on the church, right? And that works well with Harvard University because Veritas is the motto of Harvard. And it also allows the Catholics to say, we are visible in this community, we're seeking truth, and we have something to offer. The bell's inscription has this little biblical phrase from Isaiah, a voice crying out in the wilderness. You can take that different ways, you know. The architect was parishioner Edward Graham, who lived on Oxford Street, which in the part of Oxford Street that would be this parish before you get into St. Peter's. And he adorned the church with some wonderful things. Irish saints, it was a very Irish parish, really. St. Patrick altar, St. Columban mural. St. Paul addressing the Athenians and urging people to burn false books in Ephesians. The doctors of the church on the stained glass windows. And he did that explicitly to combat the rationalism that was still the legacy from the French Revolution. And then a depiction, which we saw right near where I was talking last time I was here, of the parishioners going off to spread the faith. And here's where we might give a little attention to Father James Walsh, a native of the parish, who was one of the co-founders of Maryknoll. And he was ordained as a Boston priest in 1892, sent to St. Patrick's, Roxbury. Historians would love it that he's kept a diary of his years there. And also, he was made in 1903 director of the propagation of the faith for the diocese. He started a magazine, The Field Afar. I love the title of that. And then 4 years later started Maryknoll. The Field Afar magazine became part of Maryknoll. In 1933, 3 years before he died, he was made a bishop. And he certainly, with others, spearheaded the Maryknoll effort throughout the world from St. Paul Parish in Cambridge. Good for this parish. And then Paul and Peter are also depicted in the church. The mother church of St. Paul's is St. Peter, and it also represents town and gown a bit. The property at 1033 Massachusetts Avenue, in its rear part, they had the convent there, an annex for the school, which was outgrowing its space, and headquarters for the Holy Name Society. So, Father Ryan achieved an awful lot, and he was somebody who also was part of the Knights of Columbus. Think of this for service of the poor. Knights of Columbus from this parish in the 19-teens opened up Columbus Day Nursery, 252 Green Street, to help families who were mostly struggling families to have something of a social service for them. And it was the Knights of Columbus, which was very heavily made up of St. Paul parishioners, but not only. Also, St. Paul's during this time became a seedbed for Cambridge politicians. So many of the politicians were families from St. Paul's Parish, and they assumed important positions, especially mayoral positions. In 1925, not that long after the opening of the church, came the death of Father Ryan, who had served 36 years, half of them as parochial vicar, half as pastor. Appointed to succeed by Cardinal O'Connell was Father Augustine Hickey. And he kind of stands out, I would say, of all the pastors. Sorry, Father Kelly. He stands out among all the pastors because he served 40 years, but also he was quite the man. He was a little guy. I remember seeing him one time, and I was intrigued by how short he was, but how decked out with all the Monsignor robes and all that. Bald, devout, proper. I have a young picture of him and an older picture of him there on the sheet. He was a native of Cambridge, but not this parish, St. Mary's Parish. He lived on Market Street and Fayette Street. And he was the former superintendent of schools for the Archdiocese, and he was very interested in good liturgy. When he came, he sold 2 Ellery Street lots and purchased more property near this site, probably to expand this site somewhat. One thing that happened with Father Hickey was that he was very interested in the parish as the parish. I would say this is arguably more so than the parish as the strength of Harvard campus ministry. And so he gave that work to his assistant, whoever it might have been, a string of them did it. And he was very interested in working with the people in the parish, but very open to Harvard. He received an honorary Doctor of Education degree from BC. After all, he had been superintendent of schools. He took a real strong interest in St. Paul's School. He was made a Monsignor in 1937, and then in 1940, Harvard attempted to give him an honorary doctorate. He went to Cardinal O'Connell and said, "I'm inclined to decline." And the thought about it would be that he knew well that Cardinal O'Connell had been not given an honorary doctorate, and it would be a little bit awkward. So it was the degree that wasn't, as one of our priests described it. Okay? In the midst of Father Hickey's time, there were demographic shifts that were happening. And post-World War II, all around Boston, the inner suburbs were emptying out. People wanted a yard, they wanted parking, they wanted a garage, single-family housing, no more living with the neighbors up and down and next to you and all that. Also, the population was aging. And let's not forget, Harvard was on the expansion. So all those things came together, and the peak of growth was really in the 1940s, and then it went down rather quickly, even more precipitously than for most of the inner suburbs of Boston. In 1944, with a new bishop, soon to be Cardinal Cushing, in 1958, Cardinal Cushing, he appointed Hickey his vicar general. It didn't mean what it means today. It was kind of an honorary title. It was pro forma, you might say. You had to have somebody be the vicar general. He was given that job. But he wasn't involved probably in the day-to-day running of the diocese. But he probably wasn't out on the margins completely either. In 1952, he was given a rather rare honor, protonotary apostolic. He could wear something of a bishop's regalia and all that. With the coming of the decline in population in the parish came an interesting experience. In 1963 was founded St. Paul's Choir School. It was able to be founded because of Father Hickey's deep devotion to liturgical music and liturgical life. Very impressive. And you didn't find that in a lot of priests in those years. And Theodore Maria, his good friend, was not the first of the great musicians in this parish, but he was one in a long line, and he certainly took his proper place. And the two of them together put their heads together and said, wouldn't it be great to have a choir school? In our school, we certainly have the room. In the 1950s, late 50s, the school went from 2 of each grade to 1 of each grade. And so they opened the choir school in that opportunity they had to do it. Monsignor Hickey was made chair at Vatican II's prompting of what our diocese did, as all dioceses should have done, to have a liturgical commission, and the chair of that was Monsignor Hickey. He died the next year. He retired the next year, excuse me, and he lived for 7 years more at Regina Coeli in Boston. He's the first priest of the Archdiocese to move to Regina Coeli in Boston, and he died at 89, so he moved there at 82, and he's buried in, where else? St. Paul's Cemetery in Arlington, the parish cemetery, okay, the once parish cemetery. Okay. So during his time came a lot of innovation, a lot of care for the poor, a lot of care for liturgy and music. What also happened during his time, as he pulled away somewhat from close ministry to the students of Harvard, it created something of a vacuum filled by the St. Benedict Center, which is associated with Father Leonard Feeney, a Jesuit. It's been said about Father Leonard Feeney that in his work during the 40s, he was a wonderful, eloquent speaker. No one could take away from that. But among Jesuits, he wasn't known as one of their great theologians, but he could attract a crowd. He was very easy to listen to and all that. So to make a long story short, after a while, his interpretation of that wonderful patristic maxim, extra ecclesiam nulla salus, outside the church, no salvation, his interpretation of it was so strict that it incurred correction, you might say, from Rome. I think we talked about this last time. The Pope, Pius XII, wrote to Archbishop Cushing and said, this is how we understand it, and it wasn't the strict interpretation of Feeney. So Feeney left. Feeney was excommunicated, moved with his group from the Harvard University area here to the town of Harvard up northwest of Boston. He was later reconciled. But it was something that made this area kind of a famous area, and this place kind of a center of controversy. After that, the parish, in connection with the diocese, took over more of the ministry to the people of Harvard. And so the vacuum wasn't as strong. And obviously, they needed to be careful that they had some really good, strong people who could be pastorally and theologically astute. In 1968, the property at 1033 Massachusetts Avenue was sold. The Sisters of St. Joseph, though a few of them were still teaching in the school, moved up to Matignon, then to Mount St. Joseph Academy. And after that, there were only 3 or 4 sisters in the school. The school became reduced to the choir school grades, and the girls of the parish and the non-musical boys didn't come anymore. For a while, in the beginning, from the 1963 into the 70s, there were kind of a co-mingling of girls and boys and musicians and non-musicians among the students. But the parish had certainly changed a lot, and it happened, I think, I could say, without a lot of angst, and there were other schools the kids could go to. Interestingly, too, at Vatican II, we talked about demographics, but there's another thing I would call church demographics, if you will. At Vatican II, there was an urge for people to really practice liturgical life and have good music and things like that, and a lot of thrusts for that came out of Vatican II. St. Paul's Parish was poised to hit the heights on that. And so St. Paul's Parish became, after Vatican II, something of a magnet church, it seems to me, and a magnet parish. So even though the number of people who lived in the parish was not as high, still the number of people who came was affected by the attractiveness of what St. Paul's had to offer. And it has become, along with a few other parishes in the Archdiocese, a parish that has its own caste. Monsignor Dennis Sheehan used to say about this parish to anyone who would listen, we have, and he'd say how many zip codes. It was a lot, because people come from far and wide to call this their home. One other thing we could look at that would be important would be St. Paul's and its relationship to Harvard. In the beginning, there was the Puritan anti-Catholicism. It might not have been very friendly to Catholics, but it certainly was explicitly religious. And then, in the early 1800s, there came a pendulum swing, and a lot of people in the Puritan tradition and a lot of people connected to Harvard swung, pendulum-wise, toward Unitarianism, which is something more of a humanitarian religion, not nearly as explicitly religious, especially as the decades continued to unfold, but very much known for its humanitarianism and very open to tolerance. After all, if the tenets of the faith are not something that are going to be quite as important to us as they were to our ancestors, or the same ones at least, will be not so important to us, then we can stomach the Catholics a little bit more. Yeah. Now, before that all happened, though, in 1757, there was a series of lectures set up. Judge Paul Dudley, Dudley Square in Roxbury, Dudley set up what were called the Dudleyan lectures. And every fourth year of these annual lectures was supposed to be given over to the evils of Catholicism and the papacy. And so it was interesting to see in the beginning, they were really harsh, some of these lectures. But then around the time of the assertion of the Unitarian ideas, they tended to say, well, these ideas have been bad in the past, but right now things are better. A lot of that was owing to Bishop Chevreus and Father Matignon from Boston being such good neighbors to the Unitarians. In 1846, Boston got a native son as its bishop, Bishop John Fitzpatrick, a graduate of Boston Latin School, which always has a connection to Harvard through the history. And Fitzpatrick and Harvard shared mutual respect. They both valued reason, a real hallmark of Unitarianism, and they valued moderation. And they gave Fitzpatrick, Harvard did, an honorary doctorate in 1861. After that came a burst of Irish admissions. The number of people from Ireland was going way, way, way up in Boston, and there was an increased Catholic presence. With Archbishop Williams in the late 1800s, there was also a steady increase of Catholics at Harvard. In 1893, they formed what they called a Catholic club. Now, some people have said it was more of a social club, maybe more for the fact that, there was a different social caste for a lot of these Harvard students who were Irish immigrants' children. Anyhow, there was also the establishment of the Phillips Brooks House in 1900 for religious groups to meet there, not just Catholic, but others. Catholics certainly were given their place. In 1907, with Cardinal O'Connell's coming, relations were cooler because he was a little bit more pugnacious about the whole thing. Father Hickey in 1930 did a little report. What's it like at Harvard to be Catholic? And he said this: Harvard University is utterly indifferent to religion, and the Catholic Club doesn't make too much of a difference for helping Catholicism to grow from the faith point of view, he more or less said. There was a clubhouse era from 1907 to 1925 in which there was, from the gift of the building on DeWolf Street given by O'Connell to the parish, there was a Harvard clubhouse which worked to create a little bit of collegiality among the Catholics. And in 1933, under Father Hickey, he converted that Harvard Catholic clubhouse to a parish house. He didn't think that it was really doing its proper job to serve the Harvard students. He thought it would be better to have it used for the parish. and the meetings that might have been held there were moved to the different houses of Harvard from 1933 onward. And then in 41 came that St. Benedict Center. In the late 50s came the Catholic Student Center, which I think used part of the property of the big school that had too much room at that point. And then in the 70s and onward, there's been the team of usually very closely diocesan appointed people with some other people hired, Bishop Bowles and Father Tom Powers, Sister Evelyn Ronan, Father John McGinnis, and a whole stream of people since then, right down to your own staff now. Bishop Bowles took on the idea of the pastor as being the chief Catholic chaplain at Harvard, and he kept things together in that way. I'm just looking at my notes for other things. I think most of what I've said, most of what I wanted to say, I've said. With a little bit, let's go back to why the parish is so interesting, and then I'll close. You see breadth of properties and involvements. A lot of good things have been done here. Town and gown, interesting. Liturgy and music for sure. Demographics, length of the pastorates, Feeneyism, prominent figures. Monsignor Hickey himself, very prominent figure. Avery Cardinal Dulles became a Catholic right here at St. Paul's. Isn't that wonderful? Cardinal Law was here as a Harvard student. Bishop Bowles, you've had one of your pastors to be a bishop. And then Father Walsh. The CSJ connection from almost the very beginning. The uniqueness of the church, and then the Christian service. I remember the same Sister Mona who I had in high school, she taught here for years in the junior high, and she described, it's where I learned this little phrase, she described St. Paul's Masses as avant-garde. She was assigned here like the 40s and the early 50s, and ahead of other places, and she was so happy to have been assigned here and just loved going to Mass here when she lived at 1033 Massachusetts Avenue. You see on the sheet that I gave you some pictures, and I think they speak for themselves. There's the map of the other parishes. Some people might be interested in that. Cambridge is famous for having so many national parishes. Almost every ethnic group had a parish here. Almost all of them in East Cambridge or near East Cambridge, except for the French parish up in North Cambridge. Notice around the St. Paul's area, no ethnic parishes were here, though there was a Holy Cross Armenian church, which would not be considered our archdiocese, on Mount Auburn Street for many, many decades. All right, so I'll stop there. You see a good picture of some of the buildings. I remember the old school, as many of you might. This book, which is the source of so much of this has to be one of the finest parish histories I have ever read anywhere in the United States. It is stupendously good, by Jeffrey Wills, written in the early 90s. It's very strong on the parish, and then it's very strong on Harvard, and has lots of interviews in it. I have to teach a course next fall to the pre-theologians, a required course on the history of the archdiocese, which I hope they're going to like, taking a required course on that. Anyhow, I'm going to have them read this, I think, because you can't do any better for a parish history than this. Okay.